Sometimes a badge doesn't reveal who holds the law. Sometimes it reveals who thinks they're above it. The tow truck's amber lights flashed across the polished windows of the Fulton County Courthouse as a crowd of early commuters slowed their pace, drawn by the unmistakable sound of steel chains tightening around a dark gray sedan parked along the curb. It was barely 8 o'clock on a cool Monday morning, and downtown Atlanta was already alive with attorneys carrying leather briefcases, courthouse staff balancing coffee cups, and reporters hoping another ordinary day might unexpectedly become tomorrow's headline. Standing beside the tow truck with his arms folded across his Navy uniform was Officer Ethan Miller, his expression fixed somewhere between confidence and irritation. He glanced at his watch, then at the woman walking briskly toward the vehicle, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Maya Reynolds slowed only slightly. Dressed in a charcoal business suit with a simple navy blouse, she carried herself with calm purpose rather than urgency. A slim leather portfolio rested beneath one arm, and a government-issued identification holder peeked from inside her jacket pocket, though she made no effort to display it. Her attention settled first on the sedan, then on the steel hook already secured beneath its frame. "Officer," she said evenly, stopping several feet away. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." Ethan barely looked at her before gesturing toward the tow operator. "No misunderstanding," he replied. "Vehicles being removed." Maya's eyes moved toward the parking sign mounted beside the sidewalk. The permit designation matched the temporary authorization clipped clearly inside her windshield. She looked back at him. "The permit is valid." Ethan shrugged without concern. "Not from where I'm standing." Several people paused nearby. A courthouse clerk whispered something to another employee. Two tourists slowed long enough to watch before quietly pulling out their phones, uncertain whether they were witnessing a routine parking dispute or something far less ordinary. Maya remained composed. "Would you mind explaining why my vehicle is being towed?" Ethan finally met her eyes, though not with curiosity. "Because people can't just park wherever they feel like and expect special treatment." His voice grew louder, almost inviting the growing audience to hear. "Doesn't matter how important you think you are." The tow truck engine rumbled as the sedan lifted several inches off the pavement. Maya inhaled slowly. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught her that emotion rarely changed facts, but patience often exposed them. "My permit was issued through the courthouse administration," she answered. "You're welcome to verify it before continuing." Ethan laughed quietly. "Funny. Everybody suddenly has connections when they're about to lose their car." A few uncomfortable glances passed through the small crowd. One elderly man frowned, but kept walking. Another courthouse employee lowered her eyes, choosing silence over involvement. Maya reached into her portfolio, removed a neatly folded document, and held it where Ethan could see it without stepping closer. "Here is the authorization." He didn't even read it. "I'm not interested." Instead, he nodded toward the tow operator. "Finish loading it." The heavy winch tightened once more. Maya's gaze drifted upward, lingering for only a second on the courthouse security camera positioned above the entrance, then toward the small body camera secured neatly to Ethan's uniform. She noticed both were recording. She said nothing about either one. Instead, she quietly folded the paper, slipped it back into her portfolio, and memorized the officer's badge number stitched beneath his name. Ethan mistook her silence for defeat. What he never considered was that some people stopped arguing not because they had run out of answers, but because every unnecessary word only strengthened the evidence waiting to speak for itself. The tow truck disappeared into morning traffic with Maya Reynolds' sedan secured behind it, leaving an empty parking space that seemed far larger than the few feet of concrete it occupied. Around her, the courthouse plaza gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Lawyers hurried through the revolving doors, security officers greeted employees by name, and the conversations that had briefly stopped to watch the unusual scene slowly resumed. To almost everyone standing there, it looked like another ordinary disagreement between a police officer and a citizen. They did not know that the quiet woman standing alone on the sidewalk had spent years building a career on recognizing the difference between an honest mistake and an abuse of authority. Maya glanced at her watch. In less than 30 minutes, a pretrial hearing involving multiple allegations of official misconduct would begin inside Courtroom 7. She had prepared for weeks, reviewing witness statements, examining departmental policies, and organizing evidence with the careful discipline that had earned her respect throughout the district attorney's office. Arriving late was not an option. Losing her composure was even less acceptable. She adjusted the leather portfolio beneath her arm and began walking toward the courthouse entrance without looking back. Behind her, Officer Ethan Miller watched with quiet satisfaction. He expected frustration. He expected complaints. Instead, he saw someone who simply continued forward as though the inconvenience would eventually become someone else's problem. That calm unsettled him far more than anger would have. One of the younger officers standing nearby approached carefully. "Did dispatch confirm the violation?" he asked in a low voice. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Everything is handled." The younger officer glanced toward the parking sign, then toward the empty space where the sedan had been parked only moments before. He appeared ready to ask another question, but thought better of it. Experience had taught him that challenging Ethan in public rarely ended well. Inside the courthouse lobby, Maya passed through security with practiced efficiency. The deputies recognized her immediately and welcomed her with polite smiles, though they noticed she had arrived on foot instead of driving into the secured employee garage as usual. One administrative assistant hurried toward her. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds. I thought you were running late." Maya offered a faint smile. A small delay outside. She said nothing more. There was no accusation in her voice, no frustration, and no attempt to gather sympathy from anyone around her. Instead, she asked for an updated hearing schedule and continued toward her office. Her assistant, Daniel Brooks, was already waiting beside a conference table covered with neatly organized files. He looked up the moment she entered. "Your car is not outside," he observed. Maya placed her portfolio on the table. It was towed. Daniel stared in disbelief. "Towed? From a reserved government space?" Maya simply nodded. "Yes. That cannot possibly be legal." She answered with remarkable calm. "That is exactly what we are going to determine." She opened her portfolio and carefully removed the parking authorization, a printed timeline of the morning's events, and a small notepad. Without emotion, she wrote the exact time, the location, Officer Ethan Miller's badge number, the tow company name displayed on the truck, and every statement she could remember hearing. She did not embellish a single detail. Every sentence was precise. Every observation was factual. Years in court had taught her that memory fades, but documentation endures. As she closed the notebook, sunlight filtered through the office window and reflected across the polished courthouse floor below. Somewhere outside, Ethan Miller believed the incident was already over. Maya understood something he did not. Some cases begin the moment everyone else thinks they have ended. By 9 o'clock, Courtroom 7 carried the familiar weight of expectation. The polished oak benches were nearly full. Attorneys quietly reviewed legal pads. Reporters arranged their notebooks, and spectators settled into patient silence beneath the great seal mounted high above the judge's bench. The room felt orderly, almost routine, yet beneath that calm surface rested months of preparation that very few people fully understood. Maya Reynolds stood at the prosecution table with the same quiet confidence she had displayed outside the courthouse. Nothing in her expression revealed the inconvenience of the morning. Her files were arranged with careful precision, each document marked with color-coded tabs, every exhibit positioned exactly where she expected to find it. Daniel Brooks noticed the fresh page lying on top of her legal folder, the one containing the timeline she had written only minutes earlier. It rested there beside the case materials as naturally as though it had always belonged. He leaned slightly closer and spoke in a respectful whisper. "You could still report what happened after the hearing." Maya continued organizing the exhibits without looking up. "I will." Daniel hesitated. "Most people would be furious." She offered a calm reply. "Anger rarely persuades a judge. Facts do." Across the room, several defense attorneys entered together, exchanging polite greetings with courthouse staff. Among them was attorney Richard Coleman, a veteran litigator who had faced Maya in numerous cases over the years. He respected her preparation even when he disagreed with her arguments. As he approached counsel table, he noticed she had arrived without her usual briefcase cart. "Everything all right this morning?" he asked. Maya smiled politely. There was an unexpected delay outside. Richard nodded. "Knowing you, I imagine someone documented it." Her smile widened only slightly. "Someone certainly did." Moments later, the courtroom doors opened once more. Officer Ethan Miller stepped inside, wearing his patrol uniform. He had been instructed to provide routine courtroom security for the morning calendar, an assignment he accepted without much thought. He entered with the relaxed confidence of someone expecting another predictable shift. His eyes swept across the courtroom until they stopped at the prosecution table. For the briefest moment, he froze. Maya Reynolds looked up from her documents and met his eyes with the same composed expression she had worn outside. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no visible resentment. She simply acknowledged his presence before returning to her notes, as though nothing unusual had happened between them less than an hour earlier. Ethan frowned, uncertain why the sight unsettled him. One of the courthouse deputies walked over and greeted Maya warmly. "Good morning, Counselor Reynolds." Another prosecutor joined the conversation. "The judge wants to discuss scheduling with you before opening statements, Ms. Reynolds." Ethan listened without appearing to listen. "Counselor Reynolds. Ms. Reynolds." The names echoed quietly inside his mind. He glanced toward another deputy standing near the entrance. "Who is she?" he asked casually. The deputy looked surprised. "You do not know?" Ethan shook his head. "That is Maya Reynolds. She is the district attorney leading today's hearing." For a second, the sounds inside the courtroom seemed strangely distant. Ethan's attention shifted back toward the prosecution table, where Maya calmly reviewed her files beneath the morning sunlight streaming through the tall courthouse windows. Nothing about her posture suggested triumph. Nothing suggested revenge. She looked exactly like someone preparing to do her job. Yet Ethan suddenly remembered every word he had spoken outside, every assumption he had made, every opportunity he had ignored to simply verify a parking permit before ordering the tow truck. The realization settled slowly, not because he fully understood the consequences, but because he had just discovered that the quiet woman he believed he could dismiss without consequence possessed something far more powerful than the authority of a patrol badge. She possessed the patience to let the truth arrive on its own schedule. The hearing began with the quiet confidence that only years of preparation could create. The judge entered. The courtroom rose together, and within moments everyone settled back into their seats as the morning calendar officially moved forward. Maya Reynolds stood and presented the opening matters with the same measured professionalism that had defined her career. Every sentence was deliberate. Every document appeared exactly when it was needed. Across the room, Officer Ethan Miller remained near the courtroom entrance, assigned to security, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the prosecution table. The discovery of Maya's position continued to echo in his mind. He told himself the towing incident had been nothing more than a routine enforcement decision. He repeated the thought again and again, hoping repetition alone would make it true. During a short recess, Ethan stepped into the hallway where another officer, Sergeant Michael Harris, was reviewing the afternoon assignments on a tablet. Michael looked up and immediately noticed Ethan's unusual silence. "Everything all right?" he asked. Ethan hesitated before answering. "That prosecutor inside. Maya Reynolds. How long has she been the district attorney?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "Several years. She has one of the strongest records in the office." Ethan forced a casual shrug. "I did not recognize her." Michael smiled faintly. "Most people recognize the work before they recognize the person. She keeps a low profile." Ethan nodded but said nothing. The conversation ended, yet the uneasiness remained. Back inside the courtroom, Daniel Brooks quietly handed Maya another folder containing supplemental exhibits for the hearing. As she accepted it, a folded sheet of paper slipped from her portfolio onto the counsel table. Daniel reached for it instinctively before stopping. It was the handwritten timeline she had created immediately after the towing incident. Every observation had been recorded with exact times, locations, and quotations. Maya calmly placed it back into the folder without breaking her concentration on the hearing. Daniel lowered his voice. "You really documented everything." Maya answered without emotion. "The details matter most while they are still fresh." "Do you think the officer understood who you were?" She looked briefly toward the courtroom entrance where Ethan stood speaking with another deputy. "No," she replied. "That is not the important question." Daniel looked puzzled. "Then what is?" Maya closed the folder carefully. "Whether he understood his responsibility." The hearing resumed, and witness testimony continued throughout the morning. Evidence was introduced, legal arguments were exchanged, and the courtroom followed its ordinary rhythm. Yet beneath that routine, Another story was quietly taking shape. Outside, courthouse security cameras had preserved every minute of the encounter in the parking area. Ethan's body camera had also remained active during the entire exchange. Dispatch records contained the exact times of every radio communication. The towing company maintained electronic logs documenting who authorized the removal and when the order had been received. Even the parking authorization issued to Maya carried a digital timestamp generated by courthouse administration. None of those records cared about opinions. None cared about assumptions. They simply existed, waiting for someone willing to compare one fact against another. Near lunchtime, Ethan finally walked outside to retrieve a bottle of water from his patrol vehicle. As he crossed the plaza, he noticed the parking space where Maya's sedan had stood only hours earlier. The empty space seemed strangely difficult to ignore. For the first time that day, he looked up and noticed the courthouse surveillance camera mounted directly above the entrance. Its lens pointed toward the exact location where the tow truck had lifted the vehicle. Ethan stopped walking. The realization arrived quietly, without warning. Cameras did not become nervous. Documents did not forget conversations. Timestamps did not change their stories. And evidence never cared who believed they were in control when the recording first began. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the courthouse plaza, casting long shadows over the stone steps where hundreds of people passed every day without realizing how many important decisions began long before anyone entered a courtroom. Inside her office, Maya Reynolds closed the final file from the morning hearing and reached for a different folder, one that had nothing to do with the case she had just argued. The handwritten timeline rested neatly on top, followed by copies of her parking authorization, employee access records, and the receipt confirming that her vehicle had been released to the towing company. Daniel Brooks returned carrying a fresh cup of coffee before noticing the new stack of documents spread carefully across the conference table. "You are already building the file?" he said quietly. Maya nodded. "Every case begins with the facts." Daniel looked through the papers without touching them. "You really think this goes beyond a parking mistake?" Maya paused before answering. If it were simply a mistake, verification would have taken less than 1 minute. She pointed toward the authorization. The permit was visible. "I offered documentation. I requested verification. None of those opportunities were accepted." Daniel slowly understood what she meant. The issue was no longer about where a vehicle had been parked. It was about the choices that followed after the truth had been presented. Maya opened another folder containing public records related to city towing procedures. Every policy outlined the same expectation. Officers were required to verify authorization before ordering removal whenever documentation was immediately available. She placed the policy beside her own timeline without making a single comment. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Miller sat alone in the patrol briefing room, staring at the incident report displayed on his computer monitor. He read each sentence several times before realizing how incomplete it appeared. There was no mention of the permit Maya had shown him. There was no reference to her request that he verify the authorization through courthouse administration. There was no explanation for declining to review the document she had calmly offered. Ethan rested his elbows on the desk and rubbed his forehead. Something that had seemed insignificant only hours earlier was beginning to feel surprisingly difficult to explain. Sergeant Michael Harris stepped into the room, carrying several afternoon assignments before noticing Ethan's unusually thoughtful expression. "You have been quiet all day," Michael observed. Ethan minimized the report on his screen. "Just thinking about this morning." Michael placed the folders on the table. Sometimes the smallest decisions become the ones people remember. Ethan forced a faint smile, though it disappeared almost immediately. Across town, the towing company's administrative office processed routine paperwork from the day's removals. Electronic records automatically logged the dispatch request, arrival time, photographs taken before transport, and the authorization number entered by the responding officer. The computer system quietly preserved each detail without opinion or interpretation. Digital records did not recognize rank, reputation, or personal assumptions. They simply remembered. Late that afternoon, Maya received a call from the courthouse facilities manager confirming that surveillance footage from the entrance cameras had been securely archived according to standard retention policy. She thanked him politely and ended the call without celebration. She had not requested favors. She had only asked that ordinary procedures be followed exactly as written. Standing beside her office window, she watched employees leave the courthouse as another workday slowly came to an end. Somewhere beyond the evening traffic, her sedan still sat inside the secured storage lot waiting to be released. Recovering the vehicle would take only paperwork and time. Recovering public trust after authority had been exercised without fairness was something far more difficult, and Maya understood that the next chapter would not be written by emotion, but by evidence patiently assembled one undeniable fact at a time. The following morning arrived with clear skies over downtown Atlanta, but inside the district attorney's office the atmosphere was focused rather than relaxed. Maya Reynolds unlocked her office before most of the staff had arrived and quietly arranged several folders across the conference table. Overnight, new records had been added to the growing file. The towing invoice had been obtained through the city's online records portal. Courthouse parking authorization logs had been certified by administration. Security camera preservation requests had been acknowledged in writing. None of the documents made dramatic accusations. Together, however, they formed a timeline that was becoming increasingly difficult to challenge. Daniel Brooks entered carrying another stack of printed emails. The facilities department responded, he said. Every camera covering the front entrance remained operational yesterday morning. Maya accepted the papers with a grateful nod. That confirms the visual record. Daniel hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind since the previous afternoon. Are you preparing an internal complaint? Maya looked thoughtfully toward the courthouse visible through her office window. An internal complaint addresses policy. What happened yesterday may involve something larger than policy. Daniel understood immediately. Equal treatment under the law. Maya closed the folder gently. Authority only deserves respect when it follows the rules it expects everyone else to follow. At nearly the same hour, Officer Ethan Miller reported for duty with unusual uneasiness. During roll call, routine assignments were distributed, but he noticed several supervisors speaking quietly near the front of the room. Whether their conversation involved him or not, he could not tell. For the first time in years, ordinary silence felt uncomfortable. After briefing, Ethan logged into the department database, intending to review the towing authorization once again. Instead, a notification appeared requesting supplemental documentation regarding the previous day's incident. He stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the request. The message was professional and brief. It asked him to clarify the factual basis supporting the decision to remove the vehicle despite visible documentation presented by the driver. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The question itself seemed simple, yet every possible answer led back to the same uncomfortable reality. He remembered Maya calmly offering the permit. He remembered refusing to examine it. He remembered deciding that verification was unnecessary before verification had even been attempted. Across town, Maya met with two senior attorneys from the Civil Rights Division assigned to advise government officials whenever potential constitutional issues arose. She presented the documents one by one without exaggeration or emotional language. The attorneys reviewed the records carefully, occasionally exchanging thoughtful glances, but allowing the paperwork to speak before offering opinions. Finally, one attorney closed the file. Everything appears organized. Maya nodded. Organization matters because credibility matters. The attorney agreed. If additional evidence supports this timeline, the legal questions become significant. Maya thanked them and gathered the documents without expressing satisfaction. She had spent enough years inside courtrooms to know that confidence should come from evidence rather than expectations. Later that afternoon, a courier delivered another certified envelope to her office. Inside was confirmation that the city's digital evidence unit had successfully preserved Officer Ethan Miller's body camera recording under formal legal hold procedures. Maya quietly placed the letter beside the other records before closing the file. Outside her office, courthouse employees continued moving through another ordinary workday, unaware that a routine towing decision had quietly transformed into a carefully documented legal matter. The difference between a passing inconvenience and a lasting case often came down to one simple question. When every fact is finally assembled, does the evidence tell the same story that authority tried to tell, or does it reveal a completely different truth waiting patiently to be heard? 3 days later, The matter that had begun with a single towing decision quietly reached a point where it could no longer remain an internal conversation. Inside a conference room overlooking downtown Atlanta, Maya Reynolds sat across from senior attorneys representing the city's legal affairs division. The atmosphere was calm, professional, and remarkably free of emotion. Thick binders rested neatly on the polished table, each section divided by carefully labeled tabs. No one rushed to conclusions because everyone in the room understood that conclusions built without evidence rarely survived inside a courtroom. Maya opened the first binder and walked through the timeline exactly as it had occurred. She described her arrival at the courthouse, the visible parking authorization displayed on her windshield, the request she made for verification, the refusal to examine the permit, and the decision to authorize the tow anyway. She never raised her voice. She never speculated about motives. She limited herself to observable facts supported by documents, timestamps, and recordings. One attorney turned several pages before looking up. Every statement here is supported by independent evidence. Maya nodded. Every statement can be verified. Another attorney reviewed the accompanying exhibits. Courthouse surveillance footage confirmed the sequence of events. Dispatch communication logs matched the recorded times. The towing company's electronic records aligned with both. Officer Ethan Miller's body camera documented the conversation from beginning to end. None of the evidence contradicted the written timeline Maya had prepared less than an hour after the incident. One attorney slowly closed the binder. The consistency is remarkable, Maya answered quietly. Truth usually is. Across the city, Ethan Miller had received notice that he would be interviewed by Internal Affairs regarding the incident. He entered the interview room expecting difficult questions, but he had not anticipated the level of preparation waiting for him. Investigators spoke respectfully, allowing him every opportunity to explain his decisions. They asked why he declined to examine the parking authorization that had been presented. They asked whether he had contacted courthouse administration before requesting the tow. They asked why those details were absent from his written report. Ethan answered as carefully as he could, yet each response seemed to create another question rather than resolve the previous one. The investigators remained professional throughout. They never accused him of misconduct. They simply compared his explanations against records already preserved by independent systems. When the interview concluded, Ethan walked back toward the parking lot more slowly than usual. For the first time in his career, he understood how uncomfortable it felt when every decision was measured against objective evidence instead of personal confidence. Later that afternoon, Maya received confirmation that the Civil Rights Division would formally review the matter alongside the city's legal office. Daniel Brooks read the memorandum before placing it on her desk. This has become much larger than a towing dispute. Maya folded the letter and placed it inside the growing file. It became larger the moment fairness stopped guiding authority. Daniel looked toward the stack of organized evidence. Do you ever wish he had simply checked the permit? Maya paused for several seconds before answering. Yes. Daniel seemed surprised by the simplicity of the response. Maya continued quietly. Because if he had taken 30 seconds to verify the facts, none of this would have been necessary. Outside, evening sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows where another day of hearings had come to an end. Lawyers carried briefcases toward nearby parking garages. Judges departed through private entrances. Reporters prepared stories about unrelated cases. Very few people realized that one of the most important legal battles beginning that week had never started inside a courtroom. It had started on a sidewalk, with a simple opportunity to choose fairness over assumption, and with a decision that could no longer be undone once the evidence began telling its own story. 2 weeks after the incident, the file that had started with a single handwritten timeline had grown into several organized binders resting inside a secure conference room at City Hall. Representatives from the city attorney's office, the Civil Rights Division, Municipal Risk Management, and police leadership gathered around a long oak table, each with identical copies of the evidence. There was no dramatic debate, no raised voices, and no hurried accusations. Instead, page after page was examined with careful attention. The surveillance footage played first. It showed Maya Reynolds approaching her vehicle with quiet composure, presenting documentation, requesting verification, and remaining respectful throughout the encounter. The body camera recording followed. Every statement matched the timeline she had prepared that same morning. Dispatch records confirmed no verification request had ever been made to courthouse administration before the towing decision. The electronic parking authorization demonstrated that her vehicle had been fully authorized to remain in its designated space. By the time the final document had been reviewed, the separate pieces no longer appeared separate at all. They formed one consistent account supported by independent sources that had never communicated with one another, yet all described the same sequence of events. The city's chief legal counsel quietly closed the binder and looked around the room. "We are no longer discussing conflicting versions of events," he said calmly. "We are discussing documented facts." No one challenged that observation. Maya listened without satisfaction. She had not assembled the evidence to embarrass anyone. She had assembled it because accountability depended on accuracy rather than emotion. One member of the legal team reviewed the potential civil liability facing the city. Another explained how similar incidents in other jurisdictions had resulted in expensive settlements, mandatory policy reforms, and years of federal oversight. The financial exposure alone was significant, but everyone understood that public confidence carried a value that could not be measured in dollars. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Miller sat in another building waiting for an administrative update. The confidence that had once defined his posture had quietly disappeared. Days of interviews, document reviews, and unanswered questions had replaced certainty with reflection. He replayed the morning outside the courthouse again and again inside his mind. Each time, the same realization returned. Everything could have changed if he had accepted the permit, read the authorization, or made one brief verification call. None of those choices required extraordinary effort. They required only the willingness to pause before reaching a conclusion. Later that afternoon, Maya met briefly with Daniel Brooks in her office. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the courthouse windows as he placed another memorandum on her desk. "The city wants to begin formal settlement discussions," he said. Maya looked at the letter before carefully closing the file. "That is their decision." Daniel studied her expression. "You knew this might happen." She answered thoughtfully. "I hoped something else would happen first." "What was that?" Daniel asked. Maya looked through the office window, toward the same entrance where everything had begun. "Someone recognizing the mistake before the lawyers became necessary." Her answer lingered in the quiet room long after the conversation ended. Outside, another line of people climbed the courthouse steps carrying briefcases, legal files, and hopes that justice would treat every person with equal dignity. Most of them would never know how close the system had come to failing one of its own servants over something that should have lasted less than a minute. Yet because one woman chose patience over outrage, documentation over assumption, and law over emotion, the truth had continued moving forward with steady determination. By the end of that day, everyone involved understood that the coming legal battle would not revolve around arguments alone. It would revolve around evidence that had remained remarkably consistent from the very first moment the camera began recording. Several months later, the case reached its final resolution inside the same courthouse where everything had begun with an ordinary morning and an avoidable decision. There were no crowded television cameras filling the hallways, and no dramatic speeches waiting outside the courtroom steps. The conclusion arrived the same way the evidence had been assembled, patiently, carefully, and according to the law. After reviewing the complete record, the city agreed to a substantial legal settlement that acknowledged the wrongful actions surrounding the towing incident and the failure to follow established procedures. Alongside the financial resolution came mandatory policy changes, expanded training requirements, and new verification standards designed to prevent similar incidents from happening again. For city officials, the settlement represented more than the cost of a legal dispute. It represented the price of allowing assumptions to replace professional responsibility. Officer Ethan Miller received formal notice that his employment with the department had been terminated following the completed administrative process. The decision cited policy violations, failures in judgment, and conduct inconsistent with the standards expected of a sworn officer. When he quietly gathered the last of his belongings from his locker, no one celebrated his departure. Some co-workers felt disappointed. Others remained silent. A few simply reflected on how quickly years of service could be overshadowed by a handful of choices made in only a few minutes. Ethan carried a small cardboard box through the station parking lot and paused before reaching his car. He looked back at the building where he had spent so much of his career. For the first time, he understood that authority had never been measured by how much power a badge could exercise. It had always been measured by how carefully that power was restrained. Across town, Maya Reynolds returned to the courthouse carrying the same leather portfolio she had held on the morning her vehicle was towed. The difference was not visible in the portfolio itself. The difference existed in what had been accomplished because she had refused to answer unfairness with anger. She answered it with documentation, patience, and respect for the legal system she had sworn to serve. Daniel Brooks joined her as they climbed the courthouse steps together. He smiled before asking, "Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended?" Maya paused near the entrance where the security camera still overlooked the plaza exactly as it had months earlier. "Every day," she replied softly. "It could have ended with one person taking a moment to verify the facts." Daniel nodded. Instead, it changed the entire department. Maya looked toward the busy sidewalk where employees, visitors, attorneys, and families walked past without knowing the history attached to that single parking space. Then perhaps something worthwhile came from it. As they entered the courthouse, another young police officer held the door open for an elderly visitor, smiled warmly, and patiently answered several questions before directing her toward the correct courtroom. Maya noticed the exchange without saying a word. Small moments of professionalism rarely appeared in headlines. Yet they were the moments that quietly strengthened public trust every single day. She continued down the familiar hallway, passing beneath the seal that represented equal justice under law. The building looked exactly as it always had, but something important had changed. Procedures had improved. Expectations had become clearer. Accountability had proven stronger than assumption. And somewhere inside every new officer beginning a career, there would now be one more lesson taught during training. Verify before you judge. Listen before you decide. Because a badge may grant authority, but character determines how that authority will be remembered. In the end, Maya never needed revenge because the truth required no assistance. It simply needed someone willing to preserve it, protect it, and allow it to speak when the time was right.